Okay, now, the topic of this course, ancient Israelite history. Now, who are the ancient Israelites? What's the difference between the ancient Israelites and the non-ancient Israelites, or the Jews, right? Does anyone have any clue? The difference between the Jews and the Israelites? Go ahead.
The term Jew or Judaism didn't arise until after the Kingdom of Judea came to exist, I think.
That's a very good effort, but that's actually not quite true. Because the Kingdom of Judea existed during the period of the Israelites. The Kingdom of Judea, according to the Bible at least, started with David, which is the 11th century BC, which is still the period of the ancient Israelites. So Jewish usually refers to the Second Temple period, not the First Temple period. It's actually incorrect, scientifically speaking, to refer to the people, the ancestors of the Jews, okay, to refer to them as Jews, because they weren't Jews. The First Temple, they were Israelites. Or, if they lived in the south, where modern Jerusalem is, then they would be called Judahites or Judeans. But the term Jewish is incorrect. But anyway, so...
What's Israelites?
Israelites is the north. The north meaning, what's the dividing line? Roughly Bethel. What is it in modern Israel?
Bethel, what is that?
That's, I'm talking about, historically, it's the name of a city. Bethel, Bethel.
Yeah,
right?
that was
right.
south.
That's roughly the dividing line between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. There used to be two separate kingdoms, right?
No.
You're not aware of that?
You mean like the Galilee?
What?
Okay.
What was the two kingdoms?
Okay, there were two kingdoms. There was the northern kingdom. There was Rehoboam, right? Rehoboam. He ruled in the south, and there was Jeroboam. He ruled in the north. He ruled in the north, right?
What?
Nobody knows what I'm talking about?
But what period?
Because you're supposed to educate us.
No,
but what period are you
I'm sorry.
It was a period of time that you're talking about.
The period of the Bible. There were two kings.
No.
Well,
After
you're talking about during the
After
it's in the Nevi'im.
right?
It's in the Nevi'im. It's not
Right.
for
For how
the period
long?
of the entire.
It's not in Torah, correct?
For how
Okay,
long?
so
Right.
so be
For how
more.
long
Can you be
after-
more specific?
Okay, after Solomon died, there were two kings who ruled over the united monarchy, right? Over everyone. That was David and Solomon.
Okay.
So that was approximately 2 generations, right?
And what
Actually
year
more.
did
Shaul was
Shlomo
before.
finish?
That's from 10 BC, okay, until about 930 BC.
Okay, so
that's
starting
80 years.
So starting 930.
Right, starting
There was the
930,
split
there
of
were
the
two
two
separate
kingdoms.
kingdoms. I'm sorry that I took it for granted. I thought everyone knew
Hold
that.
on.
Well, 1 second. You're
BC?
mixing up. David was not the first king.
BC.
Pardon me?
When you
Everything is
talk
BC. Everything in
if
this
you talk
class is going
about
to be BC.
BC, then a larger number is earlier than...
Yeah,
Correct.
10 to
So you said-
930.
Correct.
Oh, you said 10.
10 to 930.
10.
1 second.
Yeah.
Shaul
Yeah, by the
Shaul
way,
was
everything in
first.
this class, whenever I mention a date, it's always going to be before Christ or before the Common Era, whichever you prefer. Okay,
1
before
second. David
before
was
the
not
millennium.
first king.
What?
King David was not the first. Shaul was
He-
first.
Yes.
It was the first full time.
Yeah,
Shaul
true,
got kicked
true.
off. but-
Saul was, but during Saul's time, they still had a lot of difficulty with the Philistines. And so they didn't have full control over all the territories. There's a lot of friction going on there. So David is the first time, according to the Bible, okay, there's a lot of, if you continue coming to my classes, then you'll find out that there's a lot of controversy whether the biblical description of the kingdom of David is actually accurate. But according to, if you take it at face value, then he ruled over a solid kingdom. I mean, his borders were secure, and it was a united kingdom, and it was both in the north and in the south. Okay, so that's going to be the topic of this class in general. This particular presentation right now is going to focus on the patriarchal period, okay? That period of the Israelite history. So presumably the patriarchs are portrayed in the Bible as the ancestors of the Israelites, right? You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then the 12 tribes of Israel, and they gave birth to the Israelites. And so we're going to focus on that period, the period of the patriarchs. Okay, let's
Can we get a
start.
year
Slide.
for Abraham? Like, let's say the birth of Abraham?
View.
Slideshow.
Views. It's slideshow.
I don't know. I'm asking
It's
him.
about to
From current slide.
Okay.
From current slide.
Okay.
Hello, I formatted it.
Okay, patriarchal history in a nutshell. So first we're going to go over what the Bible tells us about the history, and then we're going to dissect it and see if it matches up to...
Could you just give us a year for the birth of Abraham, just so I...
Yes, we're going to discuss this.
Oh, okay.
Everything's going
Thank
to be
you.
discussed in this class.
Thank you.
Okay, so first, according to the biblical account, Abraham was the son of Terach. And he left Ur in southern Mesopotamia, and he travels to Haran in northwest Mesopotamia. I'm going to show you a map in just a second. But first, the city of Ur, right? Ur Kasdim, in English it's translated as Ur of the Chaldees. Okay, who are the Chaldees? The Kasdim. These are historical people. It's not just a word. It actually means something. The Chaldees were people who lived in the 7th century BC. Okay, that's basically a year before the first temple was destroyed. Much later than the time that Abraham presumably lived in. Okay, I'm going to get back to this in a second, but this seems to be an anachronism. An anachronism means something that is not accurate in the time setting that you're discussing. In other words, if Abraham actually came from Ur of the Chaldees, then he didn't come from the Ur of the Chaldees, he came from Ur, which later was called Ur of the Chaldees, because the Chaldees didn't exist. He didn't live among the Chaldees, for sure not. The Chaldees didn't exist until a millennium later, more than a millennium later, as we shall discuss further. The period of Abraham was approximately 2000 BC, if he existed as a real person. All right, so I'm going to show you a map in the next slide. So he moved to Haran. Haran is quite a distance from Ur. And then he went out, his family remained in Haran, and his father died there, his brother died there, and he and Lot continued southwards to what is Canaan. Now, I want to give you like a little bit of a geography here of the Near East here, so you understand the terms that I'm using here. First of all, Mesopotamia. Does anyone know what that is? Okay. You want to define it?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Mesopotamia was the first place that civilization, that we know, that history knows that civilization was formed. Civilization meaning that hunter-gatherers or just tribes living in the wild came together to live, to kind of share economically, share in other ways. Again, I'm not an
But
historian.
what does it literally mean? Is it,
It's a geographical. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, say.
It's a geographical
you know,
place.
you know what it means literally?
I
No.
can answer
All
that.
right.
Meso means between, and Potamia is the river.
That is correct. Mesopotamia, between the rivers.
The Tigris
And it
and
refers to the two
Euphrates.
rivers, Tigris and the Euphrates. And this is a Greek term. Mesopotamia is a Greek term. But this equivalent in a different language already existed. For example, in the Bible, it's Aram Naharaim. What does Naharaim mean? Between the rivers. So the word Naharaim is a Hebrew equivalent of Mesopotamia. A literal, in fact, the Greek term may have been derived from that because the Septuagint, of course, which was written in Greek, was translating the Bible. So a lot of Greek terminology relating to the Bible was simply translating the Bible, and that's how we got the term. So if those Greek translators translated Naharaim literally between the rivers, then this is how we got the term Mesopotamia. At any rate, Mesopotamia refers to the entire, this is a huge stretch of land that stretches all the way from the Persian Gulf to Syria and even Turkey. So this is a long stretch of land. I'm going to show you a map. Let's see if it shows up. Here it is. Okay. So you have, here you see the two blue lines are the rivers. And it stretches from the, let's see if this works. Oh, I can use my mouse as a pointer. Okay, from here, from the southeast, right, all the way northwesternly route, and this is Haran here. Okay, so this is all part of Mesopotamia between those blue lines. Now here, this coast here, the coast of the Mediterranean, this is what's called the Levant. This is a modern scholastic term, the Levant. It's not used in politics, it's not used in any other circles, it's only used in biblical archaeology and in biblical geography. The Levant actually is a French word, and it means the rising, meaning east, the rising of the sun. So this is, where's my mouse? Okay, so this whole coast of the Mediterranean, the eastern coast, is called the Levant. It includes modern Israel, Syria, and Lebanon actually. But Lebanon, we're not going to refer to it as Lebanon because that's a modern political designation. It's usually called Syria. This whole area here is called Syria. All right, so and
Lebanon is
Levant. It's L-E-V-A.
No, I know Levant. What I'm saying, Lebanon appears in the biblical
Yeah, but that's
term, right?
completely unrelated to Levant. Levant is a French word.
I know
Right.
those two things. I'm just saying
Lebanon, yeah.
Lebanon. You're saying
It
Lebanon
does.
is
Yeah, it does appear
is
in the
Lebanon.
Bible. The reason why we don't call it Lebanon is because the Greeks didn't call it Lebanon. Most of the terms that we have, Mesopotamia is a Greek term. Syria is a Greek term. All right? even Palestine. Palestine is actually a Roman term. The Romans, they wanted to wipe out any memory of the political existence of Judea, and so after they finally got rid of the kingdom of Judea in 135 after the Bar Kokhba revolt, they just wiped it out. No more Judea. It's Palestine, and that name stuck to this very day. And until 1948. And in 1948, some Jews wanted to recreate this thing, and then others say, no, we're going to continue calling it Palestine. But anyway, let's not go into politics.
But
So-
Lebanon is
Lebanon,
a geographic
it's a
area.
biblically accurate geographical term, but like from a historical standpoint, nobody called it Lebanon in modern history. Okay, and from, let's say, 600 BC, from the times that the Greeks came onto the scene, which is several centuries later, actually, but from the time that we have history, right, people are talking and writing about history, it wasn't referred to as a geographical unit as Lebanon. It's part of Syria. All right, so, and the other term you should be familiar with is the Fertile Crescent. Sound familiar?
Mhm.
Anyone? Okay. The Fertile Crescent. Why is it called a crescent? Because it's in the shape of a crescent, and it's fertile.
What's the it?
Where is it?
referring
Right
to?
here, you see it, this blue, the two rivers here, delineated by the blue lines. This is the right arch of the crescent, and you see that it widens as it reaches its peak in the middle, and then the left arm of the crescent is the Levant.
Could you draw the whole crescent, or?
Let's see if I can have. Hold on a second.
I think that red line is the.
Any second there. Pointer options. Highlighter. Okay. Here, I'm gonna draw the crescent.
I see.
Is this clear?
What is
So it
this
becomes
question?
wider at the top, and then it narrows again toward Hebron, along the coast of the Mediterranean. So this was fertile territory, very fertile. You had the two rivers, between the two rivers, so that irrigated this area. And here you have the Orontes River, which eventually empties into the Jordan. So, of course, towards the south it becomes more arid and less fertile, but the northern parts of it, in Syria and the northern Israel, is still fertile. And this is considered the Hula Valley, for example. Has anyone heard of that term, Hula Valley? It's in the Galilee, a very fertile area. So, in fact, if you go to Israel, that's the only place where you can find green grass. And it's also a place where the birds stop by during their migrations to feed. So this is the Fertile Crescent. It's a term that was used by scholars in the mid-19th century, and it's stuck, and it became really popular.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So Egypt was never part of Mesopotamia?
No,
Wow, that's interesting.
no. Egypt is the Nile River. Egypt also fed off a river, which is also interesting to note that ancient societies needed a river to survive. That was the very earliest form of agriculture was practiced alongside a river. Why? Because rainfall was unreliable. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it doesn't. But a river is always reliable because the river, where does the river get its rain? From the mountains, right? So somewhere along the mountain there's going to be rain, right? So in other words, you don't have to rely on local rain. Even if it rains remotely, eventually that water will come to you. And the river also has the advantage that once you figure out how to irrigate it, how to construct irrigation canals, then you can really maneuver it and you can tame it, right? You can divert it to where you want it to go. So you have a lot of control with the river. And you don't have that as much with rainwater. So the early centers of civilization that thrived on agriculture were located along either the Tigris-Euphrates, the Mesopotamia, or along the Nile River.
So Egypt had a civilization, the very first that we know that we usually in the beginning.
Egypt and Mesopotamia, those are the first agricultural civilizations. Which one came first? I don't think anybody knows. They're more or less the same time.
Were there other civilizations other than agricultural civilizations?
The word civilization usually implies agriculture because if you don't have agriculture, then it's never going to reach the point of civilization. Civilization implies writing, and the people who were hunters and gatherers didn't have writing. So writing, state, political states, the fact that you control an empire, for example, these ideas depend on agriculture. Before agriculture, before about, let's say, 5,000 BC, that's approximately when agriculture first began. So before that, you didn't have this. All right.
May I make just a quick comment? It's interesting,
Mm-hmm.
Jacob, that the traditional dates of creation sort of coincide somewhat with the traditional date, with the scholarly date of beginning of civilization. It's just the point.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, about 5,000 BC. Actually, no. That would be 3,000 BC.
Roughly.
Right. But 3,000 BC is when we start getting history. It is assumed that 5,000 BC people started, at least the beginnings of agriculture, started cultivating certain grains. But as far as detailed historical records, we have beginning 3,000 BC. Sumeria, of course, the kingdom, the empire of Sumer and Akkad. We'll get to that later. Okay, so let's discuss patriarchal history. That's our focus here. That's the topic of the class. So, patriarchal history is characterized by private affairs. Most of the stories that we see there is about people, not about kingdoms. Okay, there are some stories there about, for example, the 5 kings versus the 4 kings. Kidala Omer, king of Elam, he led an expedition against the kings from the valley in Canaan, right? The Sodom and Gomorrah. And so we have a story like that, which pertains to the public domain, but for the most part, most of the stories are private. So the problem with private affairs is that it's more difficult to corroborate. Because typically historical records are going to refer to either a major king, a person who has had an influence on history, right? Or it's going to refer to other major events in history. It's not going to refer to people who are relatively obscure. So there's, needless to say, we don't find any records of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob directly in any of the external sources. And neither would we expect. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist because of that. We wouldn't expect, let's say, the archives at Mari or Ebla or any of these other cities where scholars have discovered records of the ancient life. We wouldn't expect for Abraham to show up there. But on the other hand, we cannot corroborate the events either. There is no mention of Melchizedek, king of Salem. You guys remember that story? Melchizedek, Melech Shalem, Hotzi Lechem V'Yoyin, when Abraham returned after rescuing his nephew Lot from the king of Sodom, from Amraphel and Kedorlaomer, the Mesopotamian kings. And so the king of Sodom came out before him, and he Hotzi Lechem V'Yoyin. So there's no mention of that. Abimelech, king of Gerar, he is not mentioned. The city of Gerar existed, but not the name of Abimelech. And Potiphar is an Egyptian officer, and he was the master of Joseph. He's not mentioned anywhere. Hamor, the son of Shechem, also one of the biblical stories, Shimon and Levi, right? They destroyed the city of Shechem. So according to the Bible, Shechem was the son of Hamor. No mention of him. Ephron the Hittite, he is the one who sold a parcel of land to Abraham, which he later converted into a tomb. And here's another interesting thing. The Edomite kings, Genesis 36. This is actually a very problematic piece of text because the Edomites didn't quite exist yet at the time of the patriarchs. The Edomites is a much later people. In fact, according to our sources, the first time they appear on the historical scene is not until the Assyrians, which is the 7th century BC, much later than the time of the patriarchs. But that just shows, that really takes us into a different question, which is when the Bible was written. Okay, so this just shows that at least Genesis 36, at least this portion of the Bible that lists the Edomite kings, was not written until much, much later. The Pharaoh of the Joseph story, the word Pharaoh is not a proper name. It just means whoever was the king of Egypt was the Pharaoh. So he's not identified by name, so it's difficult for us to know who it was.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
You said it was only private affairs, but there were some. You said with some exceptions, but let's take other than the whole affair there with the war and kings. And again, this is much more than a private affair. This is something that usually does leave records because there were lots of people killed, or lots of people killed. There's some graves for them, etc., etc. So such things do usually leave some kind of record.
They should have, right.
Right.
But we don't have any records though. The 4 kings against the 5 kings, We don't have any records of that war.
Okay, so yeah, but then we can't really categorize it as a private affair. But other than that, there was a big famine in Egypt. Do we have any record of? I mean,
In Canaan, you mean?
In Egypt. In
Famine in Egypt?
Famine in Egypt at the end of Genesis. There's
Not in Egypt. In
7
Canaan.
years. 7 years of very.
Oh, that no, there's no record of that either. But I don't think no. On the contrary, no. It doesn't say there was a famine. It says that there would be a famine, unless there was a drought. Maybe a famine means you don't have what to eat.
Right.
According to the Bible, what Joseph accomplished is that there shouldn't be a famine because he saved. He
And
saved up.
There was a famine, but only Egypt was saved, and everyone was coming to Egypt. Whoever had money.
There was a famine in Canaan,
in the whole massive.
in the land of Canaan, according to the Bible. But such an event is not. It's not. We don't have any historical setting that we can assign it to, because I mean the land of Canaan wasn't a very fertile land. So I mean it's liable to be famines there all the time. That's why people didn't live there for the most part. People lived between the rivers, right, in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. The section I didn't mention that earlier, but the actual what we call the land of Canaan, modern Israel, is not a very fertile area except for the regions to the north. But where the Bible describes Abraham to have journeyed, which is the southern sections, Hebron, for example, that's not a fertile area. It borders the Judean desert.
So what about the tomb of the patriarchs? When did that first appear in history? I mean, if we assume that all those patriarchs, that they're all private people, and we don't really know, we can't really know. So what do we know about places like the tomb of the patriarchs? Is that how it's called in English? Martha, or even the cave of Raphael?
The modern tomb of the patriarchs is not historical. We don't know nothing about that. Somebody made that up. There's no continuity with that. I mean,
So where
there's no
does it
tradition
first
that
appear?
goes back all the way to the time when we know that the actual people who were buried there who were the patriarchs of the Israelites.
But where does it first appear?
Oh, there's a lot of places like that. There's, for example, Jebel Musa, right? Mount Sinai. There's a place called Mount Sinai in the Sinai Desert. Again, it's not historical. The Christians set up a convent there in about the 4th century, and somebody decided later that this is Jebel Musa. And there's tons of examples like this. In fact, Arizal, right? He went around in the 18th, 19th century, whenever he lived, I don't know when, and he started saying, this is the caver of Reb Meir, Balanes. This is the caver of... Where he took that, I don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, if you believe in divine revelation, then maybe God told him that this is the caver of Reb Meir, Balanes, but it's not historical. It's not like there was an actual tradition that you can... and if you open the caver, what are you going to see there? I don't know. Maybe some bones, but it's certainly not...
There is no way to attribute that to the actual person.
No. Most decidedly not. And the modern Ars Machpelah is meaningless from a historical standpoint. Maybe, it evokes certain emotions. And
1 second, why is it? Why you say it's nothing?
because there's no tradition. That's what I'm trying to explain to you.
Building on top of that.
There's a building, very nice, but it doesn't relate.
Underneath the building,
It doesn't relate to historical figures. Okay, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The chances that they're there is about 1 in a million. They could have been anywhere else. We don't know that they're there.
It was always known at that place. They were there.
It's not always known. Okay, I don't want to focus on that because that's besides
Just
that.
for a second, to comment about the name of the pharaoh. Perhaps there's some kind of clue in Eretz Ramses. Perhaps there's some kind of clue in Eretz Ramses, right? In other words, that may be some kind of clue, right? Because Ramses was, right? Just mentioning that, right?
All right, so now we're going to go back to your question. The chronology, right? When did Abraham live? Right? So in order to investigate further into the historicity of Abraham, we first want to identify what period he lived in according to the Bible. Okay? Let's first take the biblical version at face value, and let's see what they say. Okay, so we have Abraham. He's 75 years old when he first leaves Ur of the Chaldees. Oh no, when he first leaves Haran. And then he arrives in Canaan, and then he's 100 when he has Isaac. Isaac is 60 when he begets Jacob, and Jacob is 130 when he dies. So the patriarchal years is 215 total. And then you have the period of slavery, which is 430 years. This is in Exodus 12:40. ומושב בני ישראל שישבו במצרים 400 שנה ושלושים שנה. Does that ring a bell? 430 years. So we have 430 years, and then in 1 Kings it says that the construction of the temple took place in the 4th year of Solomon. So and it says that it's 480 years. 480 years after the Exodus. So if we tabulate all the years, then we have about 1,000 years from the time of Abraham until the construction of the temple. Now, why is the construction of the temple important? Because now we're entering into an era where we have some information. In other words, the biblical account starts meshing in with history, with actual history. There's a thing called the Shishonk inscription. Anyone heard of that?
Yes.
The Shishonk inscription. Okay. The Shishonk inscription. You want to say?
No,
What?
go ahead. It's your class. Come on.
I want participation. Okay, it's going to show up on the slides later. But the Shishonk inscription is Pharaoh in Shishonk. He was the 21st dynasty probably. This is the 9th century BC, and it is said that 10th century. After Solomon died in about 930. So he led an expedition into Egypt, and he exacted tribute, and he went all the way. He went north, and I don't know what he did exactly, but he left a trail of destruction. And so he recorded all this in the Shishonk inscription, which is inscribed on a stone in where is it located? I think it's in Karnak, if I'm not mistaken, which is a city in Egypt, which is where he had that was his headquarters, his capital. And so the Shishonk inscription is dated. Okay, we know about the Egyptians much more than we know. I mean, they left everything. They were a very advanced society. They recorded everything. So this is dated to about 925 BC. This event, when he raided what is the Canaanite territory, and so we know that this took place in the 4th year of Solomon, which is 966 BCE. Okay, so here we have the actual dates. So if we count back from 966, then it comes out that Abraham lived in the 21st century BC, 2091. And the Exodus is 1446. Okay, this is also a very important thing here. 1446 is the Exodus. Why is this important? Because it creates a lot of difficulties.
You could use the left and right arrows to just skip through.
No, I can't because I'm using the highlighter as my left one, but thanks. So what's the problem with this biblical chronology? Several problems. First of all, it's based on very long lifespans. So we would have to believe, we would be forced to believe that these people actually lived that long. Jacob, for example, living to 130. I mean, modern people don't live that long, and from what we observe in history, people have been getting the lifespan, longevity has been increasing, not decreasing. So that's one issue. In fact, this is such a big problem. It even poses an internal inconsistency because, according to the Tanakh, we have Moses and Aaron who are 4th generation from Jacob, right? And then you have Joshua, who is a descendant from Ephraim, correct? And he, according to Chronicles Divrei Hayam, he is a 12th generation. So this is definitely an inconsistency. I mean, how does 12th generation, they were like literally cousins, right?
Wait a second, according to blah blah blah, Yocheved was 230 years old when she had Moses.
Right. So that's one issue, but even if we have to believe, I'm trying to explain there's two issues here. One is they were too old, but secondly, even if we can explain that, there is an internal inconsistency here. How do you reconcile a 4th generation and a 12th generation? Like, which one is it? I mean, right?
But
I mean, both of them are presumably
years.
descendants from the sons of Jacob. One is descendant from Levi, 4th generation from Levi, and the other one is a 12th generation from, what did you say, Ephraim, right? 12th generation.
Yeah, but the 230 years is
if
opening
those
the
4
gap.
generations took 200 each, and the 12 generations took 30 each, now we can find like some kind of
right. So
ground,
right, that's what I say here. So
Which
we
is
have,
a real
we have an
check.
average of 100. No, no,
Right,
you're right.
right.
You have an average of 140 years versus an average of 39 years. Now, I don't know why would they live so much longer than them. I don't know how to explain that. Okay, another issue with this chronology is that if the Exodus was 1446, and if we take the biblical word as at face value, then 40 years earlier, 1406 is when. I'm sorry, 40 years later. 40 years later, 1406, is when the conquest of Canaan should have taken place, because the Israelites wandered 40 years in the desert. So 1406, for the conquest of Canaan, there's absolutely no archaeological remains indicating such a date. Nothing happened, essentially, in 1406. I mean, according to the book of Joshua, there was major destruction. He went around, he destroyed cities left and right, Jericho, Ai, and Chatzor, and everyone. And nothing happened. Archaeologists have dug up Chatzor, Jericho, and all these other cities. And 1406 was just an uneventful period. The 15th century, nothing really happened in that century.
And Jericho, what they dug up, there is no big walls. It's a small little city. There is nothing going on
in that period.
Not
right
at all.
Right. The Jericho is a very controversial site. At first, archaeologists used that to corroborate the Bible. They thought that it actually
Did happen.
proves, right? They proves the events. They found the wall there, and they were like all excited. This is the wall of the Bible, and it fell apart, and this is it. But then other scholars came along, and they redated everything, and they found other walls and other layers. It's many layers in Jericho, much more complicated. And it turns out that upon further examination, that not only does it not support the biblical claims about Jericho, but it actually contradicts. But that's a separate discussion. So, but for now, the focus here, the point here is that in the 15th century, there is no widespread conquest, there's no widespread destruction going on in the land of Canaan. And so what, yes, in the 12th century, that's late 13th, early 12th century, that's the period when scholars have found major chaos going on in the area. What we see is new settlements sprouting up along the central hill country, which is the Galilee basically, and south of it, Shechem, that area, and in fact hundreds of new settlements sprouted up in the late 13th, early 12th, and also the traditional powers, the centers of power, which used to be in the valleys, like Chatzor, Megiddo, these big cities, these Canaanite cities that used to be in the valleys, they exhibit a great deal of destruction in this period. So this is late 13th, early 12th. So this is about 200 years later. So if anything, in other words, what we're trying to say here is that if these conquests did take place, then the most suitable date for that would be 1200 BC.
Which is 250 years later?
Right. Which is about, 200
So unless they wandered in the desert for 290 years,
right.
It's a little bit.
Isn't there an account of something that they didn't take over the whole place at once, but it was like
That's-
city by city?
That's the Judges. The book of Judges has a
Right.
different portrayal of the conquest than the book of Joshua, which is also a whole big debate among scholars which one is true, if any of them, and how do they reconcile each other. For example, the city of Chatzor, the book of Joshua has one version of events, how it was conquered, and then the book of Judges has another story. Was it conquered twice? Or was it the same story and different scholars had a different legend, different tradition? What's going on there? And I mean, more likely, they're referring to the same tradition. It's the same story, they just had a different version of it. It wasn't conquered twice. And so what we see is that the book of Joshua had a different interpretation of the conquest than the book of Judges. So yes, you're right. The book of Judges tends to be more aligned with the view that it was gradual. But the book of Joshua claims that it was a blitzkrieg, all at once, within a few years.
You get a little bit closer if you use the same time scaling. If you use the same time scaling that already exists in the inconsistency, and then you apply it to the 40 years, you get a little bit closer.
What does that mean?
If you rescale 40 years using the same 3.5 times, you're 140 versus 40 years. If you rescale that, then you get a lot closer to.
I'm not sure what you mean by rescaling.
Meaning you're saying that its actual meaning is 40 years. I'm saying if you rescale the 40 years, just like you have the 143 versus 39. So if you adjust that to be the longer time frames, then you get closer in time to the 12th, 13th century, 13th, 12th.
Okay. Yeah.
So wait, how did the? Actually, no, never mind. I forgot my question.
All right.
Okay, I have a question. What I understand from archaeology is that the Israelite tribes, per se, have been living in Israel for a much longer time than this whole thing has been going on, than the whole legend, even though I'm not really sure how it jives with what you're saying and if you agree to this, but this is what I found, meaning to say that the Israelites have always had idols and always had certain traditions that set them apart, like monotheism, right? Like this one God. But this particular tradition, Israelite tribes, have been in Israel for like, let's say, 4,000 years versus the 2,000 that we're talking about now. Is any of what I'm saying true, or does it jive with what you're saying here?
I'm not addressing the Israelites yet. I'm still focusing on the patriarchs.
Right. Okay.
But as far as when I'm going to get to the Israelites, yes, you're right. That most scholars now believe that there was no conquest in the traditional sense of the term.
I mean, you said they were always there, and just
Correct.
the legends came
Correct.
in at a certain
Correct. But
Okay.
for that, we're going to have to get to a different right, exactly. This class is about the period of the patriarchs. And a lot of the stuff that I'm mentioning about the conquest, and I'm talking from the biblical perspective. I'm not saying that there was a conquest. I'm saying if there was one, then it wasn't in the 15th century. It wasn't in 1409. That's what I'm saying. I'm not necessarily saying that it didn't take place in the 13th century, but if anything, that's a better candidate. That's a better date for this purported conquest. Okay, I'm sorry. I gotta continue.
Could you just explain? There's something at the end of the last slide.
Oh, I
that you skipped over.
didn't discuss this yet. Oh, you talking about the previous?
At the end of the previous slide, there's something about that you skipped over. What is this? Mernepath?
Oh, the Meneptah stela. Okay. I think the picture of this is coming up soon. Okay, the Meneptah stela is a black basalt stone that was discovered in Egypt.
3 languages, right?
No. The 3 languages. No, the 3 languages is the Rosetta Stone.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the Meneptah stela was discovered in Egypt, and it mentions it says like this. It says the Pharaoh Meneptah, which is the 19th dynasty, is which is the 13th century BC. So, and he mentions that he went to Canaan and he wreaked havoc there. He conquered Yanoam. I think he mentions Gezer or Ashkelon, and then he mentions Israel's seed is no more.
That's the first mention of Israel.
Right. So that's the first mention that we have of the Israel. It's not the actual first mention of Israel, but it's the first mention of the Israel that we believe are the historical Israelites. There is actually also a mention of the term, but in a totally different context. It also appears in the Ebla archives, in the city of Ebla. The term Ishruel is also mentioned there, which is the same name, but it's totally different context, different time period, different everything. So the first time that the Israelites that we're talking about, they're mentioned in an outside source, outside of the Bible, is in the Meneptah stela, 1207 BC. Okay, again, to put things in perspective, 1207, this is roughly the time when there was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of movement. Okay, a lot of cities were destroyed. Established Canaanite cities for many, many centuries, and they were being overrun by the sea peoples. By the sea peoples were people who came from the Aegean, and they overran. They went south through Lebanon, the Levant, and they came also through the sea. The Egyptians struggled with them. The Egyptians mentioned them a lot. They caused troubles there also, and they were just basically pillaging the countryside and destroying everything, so that's the late 13th, early 12th century.
And this is 250 years after the biblical account of us officially portrayed.
Right, correct. It's 200 years later. It's 200 years after. If we take the biblical chronology literally, then it comes out to 200 years later. Yes. Okay, so this is a very important slide. This next one. Okay, here. Okay, we have several items here that appear in the Bible that are very troubling, because the problem is that they didn't actually exist in the patriarchal period. Camels are mentioned. The story of Isaac, for example, does it say there that he saw Rebecca was on a camel, right?
Yes.
Not just that, but Eliezer went with camels.
Right,
too.
Eliezer, right. Eliezer.
To drink the camels.
There you go, right, there you
And
go.
even before that, Pharaoh gave Abraham as a present. He gave
Right.
camels.
He has camels. That Pharaoh, in order to appease Abraham for taking
stealing.
his wife,
Right.
Yeah.
he gave him camels. it
Thank you.
says.
There you go. So camels are mentioned very often,
Right.
right? By the way, camel and gamal, they're cognates. They're related. But anyway, they sound alike and they come from the same source. But anyway, so the camels, did they actually exist? Now, the archaeological evidence is that they didn't. I'm
I
going
mean,
to show
camels didn't exist at the time.
No, they didn't. They weren't domesticated. They weren't used as beast animals, as a
As
beast of
farm
burden.
animals or
Beast of burden, right? They're, as pack animals. That's what I meant. As pack animals.
When do they start?
When do they start? It's approximately 11th century and later. Okay, so which is after, much after the patriarchal period.
2,000 years later.
Right. In fact, there's a site called Tel Jemma, which is on the coast of Canaan, on the Mediterranean coast. It's probably I think it's in modern Israel. And archaeologists found a lot of adult camel bones there, and they date it to the 7th century. And so it appears that this is when they first started using the camels. And this was in connection with the Assyrians. The Assyrians were extremely active in those years, the 7th century.
BC?
This was their, yeah. Everything we say in this class is BC. And the Assyrians, in fact, the Assyrians are ultimately the ones that destroyed the northern kingdom. Right? They're the ones who exiled the northern tribes, and that occurred 722 BC. So and those are the years when the Assyrians became very strong, the late 8th century. And of course, a century later, they were in turn conquered by the Babylonians, and there were no more. But for that century, between about 720 until 620 BC, the Assyrians were very strong, and they ran a huge empire that stretched all the way from Nineveh, that was their capital at the time, which is on the Tigris, all the way to the Mediterranean. And they supervised this trade that was going on from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. And as part of the trade, the camels were used as beasts of burden from the port on the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. So they found the bones of camels there, and so archaeology only shows that camels were domesticated in that period. In fact, we also see, for example, picture will come up later, hopefully. But we see, for example, there's a cave called Beni Hassan. Has anyone ever heard of it? Beni Hassan. It's a cave in Egypt, and they have murals on it which depict Semites, okay, which is a term for which Israelites were presumably fall under that category. So these Semites are coming into Egypt, and they're using donkeys, not camels. So we see that donkeys were the beast of burden at the time, not camels. Okay, next, Arabian goods. In the story of Joseph, it says, Nechot Tzri Valot, right? Holchem Lahorid Mitzrayma. So gum, balm, and myrrh. And these were goods that were commonly traded during the Assyrian period. Okay, we have records. The Assyrians left a lot of records on these things. And so the question here appears, is the biblical writer, is he talking about his own time and he's projecting these things backward, or is he, you understand what I'm saying? Because as far as that's what it seems, right?
It always seems.
That's what it seems, because I mean I'm not saying that we have definitive proof that gum, balm, and myrrh weren't traded in 15th or 16th century BC during the times of the patriarchs, but we know for a fact from the Assyrian sources they were traded in the 7th century. So what's the connection here? Philistines. Okay, this is a serious problem. The Philistines definitely did not exist. Totally. They were not there. They were not to be found in the entire Middle East, the Levant, nowhere. They came in the 12th century. And in fact, they arrived after the Israelites. They arrived in the 12th century, and they're part of the sea peoples. Right, they're part of the sea peoples. There's a lot of records, like I mentioned them earlier. The sea peoples, they came from Anatolia, from modern Turkey. They came from the Aegean Islands, maybe from Crete, and other places in the Mediterranean. And they swarmed over these established cultural centers, the cities, and they just destroyed everything in their path. And everyone was concerned. And they even came by sea. They were trying to invade Egypt, and the Egyptians sort of held them back. But like I said, the Philistines are part of those sea peoples, and they were not there before 1200. And the Philistines, Abimelech, king of Gerar, is referred to as a Philistine. So again, we have this question of how did this biblical author, how did he come to refer to this Abimelech as a Philistine? Another difficulty is that Abimelech is a Semitic name, and the Philistines definitely were not Semitic.
Sounds like a mulak.
You know?
No,
it's
Abimelech.
Abimelech.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Where again the story happened again with Avram and Sarah, right? Or Yitzchak and Rivka?
Right, the story is mentioned twice.
The story is mentioned twice.
First it's mentioned with Abraham. Abraham goes
Sarah.
to... Right. Abraham and Sarai, they go to Gerar, but in the Abrahamic account, it doesn't mention that Gerar was a Philistine city. It says he went to Abimelech, the king of Gerar, and that's when he tried to rape her, blah, blah, blah.
And Abimelech literally means the king, king
Right.
father.
Abimelech
King of Palestine.
Right. So that's
also like just a title,
that's a
right?
Semitic name. In case you're not sure what Semitic means, Semitic basically means Hebrew. Okay. Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is a Semitic language. Arabic is a Semitic language. All
But the
right.
word Hebrew is only mentioned in Genesis.
Palestine king.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about the word Hebrew. I'm just talking about modern Hebrew is a Semitic language.
That's what he's saying.
Okay. So when I'm talking about Semitic, that's what I mean. I mean, it sounds as
So how
you
does it know? Because you were saying that the real Israelites came along much later. But in Genesis, so how does, I just want to understand, how does the connection of the word Hebrew with the word Israelites, how do they connect?
Oh, that's a good question, and we're going to get to that, hopefully. If I haven't answered it by the end of the presentation, then I'll answer it then.
Wait a second, if Abimelech is just a title, why couldn't be there were like several of them?
Several of them? There could be. The reason I'm mentioning it here is because he is mentioned as the king of the Philistines. And how does Abimelech, a Semitic name, right, come to be the king of the Philistines? The Philistines were definitely not Semitic. They came from the Mediterranean. They came from the Aegean. The Aegean area was not Semitic. That's Yephes, right? The Yephes, the Shem, Cham, and Yephes. The Semites is Mesopotamia, the Arabian Desert. The Hamites are. Sorry. Okay, the Shem came from the Arabian Desert, and they eventually converged upon Mesopotamia, and they intermingled with them. So Shem is basically the Mesopotamia. Cham is Mitzrayim, Egypt, and Yafes is the Europe. Okay, the Greek islands, and so that's a totally different family. Okay, the sea people belong to Yafes. Different family, different language, different people.
But what's the source of that? I mean, I know that's
this is
what
well
taught.
established. Nobody disputes that. According to the Bible itself, and this
I know, but I
and this
thought
is
that
corroborated by
that's what we were
science that Yafes, right, is a different.
Well, the
totally different
Yafes
family.
was a real person. They were
Even if he wasn't a real person, it refers to a different category of a different tribe. Right?
So
A different
whoever
kind of
wrote
people,
those
different language.
things, I mean, the only place, the source material of those three names is the Bible. So whoever wrote the Bible had a very vast knowledge of continents apart. And again, we're talking about a time when crossing a continent could take a lifetime or two even.
Right.
So I mean, I don't get the context of that.
They might have known of the people that existed in that era.
In Europe?
Yeah, you're right.
Well,
the
they
biblical
knew-
writers knew quite a bit of geography. I wouldn't dispute that. You're right. But the question is, when did they live, though?
The question,
Right.
the question is, how could one person in Mesopotamia or the Levant know about Northern Europe, for example?
They didn't
It's
know.
almost
Northern
impossible.
Europe wasn't occupied at the time. When I refer to Europe, I mean Spain, the coasts of Spain. I'm referring to the coast of Italy and Greece. Those areas were occupied, and they were mostly engaged in trade. Because
By the way, Europe is very close to the Middle East.
not very close. Well, it
Well,
depends what parts of Europe.
The edge of
Yeah.
the
What's very close?
At any
It
rate,
also depends what
Morocco
scale
and-
you're talking about. It's close nowadays with modern
no,
transportation.
even with
Morocco
a
and
simple,
Spain is right
with
By
a
the
simple
Straits of
ship,
Gibraltar.
even with a simple ship, it would be like 30 days from Morocco
Right.
to what's
Right,
that?
just but only to
Portugal?
the west of Spain and Portugal.
Okay,
and Greece.
those are already Yepes people.
Mediterranean Europe, in other words.
yeah, Spain. There might have been a tiny colony in Spain at the time.